This presentation is brought to you by the Beljanski Foundation. Over 50 years of research towards curing cancer the natural way.
Thank you. How's everybody doing today? All right. Made it here. I flew in from Texas last night, and it was an event. My plane was a 5-hour delay, so I got here pretty late. But thanks for being here. I'd like to kind of get a show of hands. How many of you in the room have a diagnosis of an autoimmune condition? Raise your hand really high for me. So about 10 of you. 1 in 7 has autoimmune disease. And the average person won't get a diagnosis for up to 3 decades. And there are several reasons why this happens. One is because medical training on autoimmune disease is very, very lacking at this point in time. Most specialists, for example, in the field of rheumatology, rheumatology is a specialized field of medicine that deals with chronic painful autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, scleroderma, dermatomyositis, psoriatic arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, etc. Then you have endocrinology, which focuses on largely diseases like Graves' and Hashimoto's, which affect the thyroid, or Addison's, which affects the adrenal gland. Then you have cardiology, and there's no training really in cardiology on autoimmune disease, even though we know atherosclerosis is an autoimmune process. Now think about that for a minute, because heart disease kills 1 million people a year, and it's supposedly the #1 cause of death, and it's autoimmune disease. Cardiomyopathy is autoimmune disease. Then we have other fields and other specialties. General practice doctors don't really get training to any great degree with autoimmune conditions. You have neurologists, diseases like multiple sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's, or ALS. You have psychiatry, diseases like bipolar, schizophrenia, autism. These are all forms of autoimmune disease. So think about and let that sink in for just a minute. Many of what you think might be autoimmune disease, or many of you might think you know about some forms of autoimmune disease, but the vast majority of chronic degenerative disease in this country and in this world are actually forms of autoimmune disease. There's now evidence that shows that Alzheimer's is autoimmune process. There's evidence that shows that type 2 diabetes, not type 1, although type 1 diabetes is autoimmune. We now have evidence directly that shows that type 2 diabetes is also autoimmune. Now, if you look at that from the perspective of how many people die every year from chronic degenerative disease, we know that heart disease is #1 at 1 million deaths a year. But if heart disease is autoimmune disease, cancer's #2 at around 900,000 deaths a year. And by the way, cancer, I just talked about this last year at Truth About Cancer. Cancer is end-stage autoimmune disease. So that's 1.9 million deaths a year from cancer and heart disease combined, both of which have autoimmune origins. And then we take the family of autoimmune diseases, of which there are at least 100 forms of autoimmune disease. Hashimoto's, MS, AS, ALS, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, scleroderma, dermatomyositis, ankylosing spondylitis. Lots of different forms, lots of different names. The problem in today's world is that in medicine, we classify autoimmune disease as 100 different forms of disease. We don't do that with cancer. Cancer statistics, when we're adding up cancer statistics and saying how many people die from cancer, we lump it all together. When we do heart disease, we lump all the different forms of heart disease together. Hypertension, metabolic syndrome, atherosclerosis. We lump them all in the same category. Yet we separate and tease out autoimmune disease. And this is one of the reasons why it doesn't get the spotlight or the attention that it deserves. I want to share a story with you all on how I actually got into this. It was by accident, but by divine intervention. I trained in the VA hospital in the rheumatology department. Now, I'm an Air Force veteran, and so I take treating veterans at a higher level. Not that all people shouldn't be treated at a higher level, but those people deserve our respect and deserve our great care. And what I saw going on in the VA hospital was a travesty. These patients would come in with severe, crippling, debilitating autoimmune diseases. Now understand that the course of lupus or the course of a disease like rheumatoid arthritis is crippling. It takes away your ability to open a jar. It takes away your ability to walk. It takes your ability away to function overall as a whole. Now, when I was in the VA hospital, what would happen, these veterans would come in, the doctors there would do minimal exams, they would give them a diagnosis, and they would send them out the door usually with a drug called methotrexate. Now, those of you who don't know, methotrexate's an anti-cancer drug. Remember what I said earlier about end-stage autoimmune disease being cancer? So that's one of the reasons why they were using methotrexate, because it suppresses the immune reaction that creates the inflammation. But methotrexate destroys the GI tract, causes severe malnutrition, and it inhibits the healing process. So imagine you have an autoimmune disease, you get a diagnosis, you go in, and you get placed on this medication, and the medication slowly over the course of 5, 10, 15 years destroys your GI tract, causes severe malnutrition. Malnutrition leads to disease, and here you already have a disease, and you're trying to heal from the disease, and the only way the body can really heal from disease is by having adequate nutrients to go through the right biochemical processes to heal. But the drug prevents it from happening. So you're in a catch-22. Does the drug reduce pain? Sure, it does. But does it create a situation where healing cannot occur? It does, absolutely. And so what happens is these patients were on these medications for a number of years, and then when the medications failed, the doctors brought in the surgeon consults. Surgical consult day in the VA hospital. And so what would happen is the surgeon would come in, see the patient, pop the x-ray up on the white. Well, this was before digital times, right? So we had these white boxes, and you'd put the x-ray image up on the white light box. And we look at the patient and say, oh yeah, you're a great candidate for surgery. Let's just remove the joint and replace it. And he didn't touch the patient. He didn't examine the patient. He just said, let's run you over to the surgery department. And that's the way it was done. So these veterans would come in, they'd originally get a diagnosis, they'd get drugged for 10 years, and when the drugs finally failed them, they'd get surgery. But this was after 10 years of damage to the gut and severe malnutrition. How well do you think you would recover from surgery if you were malnourished? How well do you think you would recover from surgery if the medications that you'd been taking were creating vitamin and mineral deficiencies that were critical for the healing and the repair of joint tissue, that were critical for the healing and repair of collagen tissue? Because isn't surgery, after all, scheduled trauma? Yes, it is. So, I left the VA hospital, and here's why. This was autoimmune disease, right? So when we asked the fundamental question, as I did because I was a young intern with the passion and the drive to try to help people, and you know, at that age, when you're younger, you generally haven't been, life hasn't like thrown those curveballs at you enough where you're bitter, right? Or where you fail to see things through kind of this wonderful lens. So I was this young, some would call me naive, intern with great hopes for these fellow veterans. And so I dove into the literature, I dove into the research, and what I found is that we already knew what caused autoimmune disease. We already knew it. There was a model of autoimmune disease called celiac disease. Anyone here ever heard of celiac disease before? You've all probably heard of gluten. 20 years ago, I helped make that name a household word. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disease caused by gluten. Now, did you know that methotrexate can actually cause celiac disease? So gluten's not the only thing that can cause it, right? And so here we were medicating these people for 10, 20, 30 years with a drug that could actually cause autoimmune disease to treat their autoimmune disease. But I went back to my attending physician and I said, doesn't it make better sense to look at diet? Why don't we take 10 people, let's pull them aside, let's do just a brief study in-house, and let's see what the outcomes are. Let's compare the outcomes of medication versus diet change. I was promptly told no, that we weren't going to do that. So I went back to the drawing board. I was a research fiend when I was in graduate school, so Jesse Jones Medical Library was right across the street. I spent hours there. I went back, and I found a lot of research on fasting and how if a person would fast for 48 hours, we could actually see their autoimmune pain go away. And I thought, celiac disease, that's gluten, that's food. Fasting, pain goes away. That's not eating, that's also food. It's not rocket science, is it? So I took that fasting research to my attending physician, and promptly I was told, forget about it. So then I went back to the drawing board one more time, and I pulled literature on omega-3. Omega-3 fatty acids could be used in chronic pain cases, and it was more effective than non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, according to some research. Well, I thought I might have a hit here because doctors were prescribing a prescriptive form of omega-3 fatty acids, so I thought, okay, we could just have them prescribe the drug. That's not too far of a leap, right? I was promptly told no. Stop asking, stop trying to change the paradigm. I don't know. I was of the thought that here we have this paradigm that doesn't work. The outcomes, frankly, suck. And these veterans and how many other people have autoimmunity? In the United States alone, 50 million. So there's 50 million people that are being treated this way with no hope for an outcome this positive. So I left the VA hospital. And one of my very first patients in private practice was a little girl. And she was brought to me by her mom. She was 9 years old. 9 years old, she had a permanent stent embedded in her arm. You know why? Because she was in and out of the hospital so frequently to have IV pain medication because her flares were so severe. Her knees, imagine this little tiny framed little girl, knees swollen up this big that she couldn't walk. Now, she had her diagnosis at the age of 2. From early on, this little girl, her name was Ginger, her diagnosis came at the age of 2 because she wasn't crawling, because she was in chronic pain, she was in chronic colic, and her knees were swollen. And so from the age of 2 to the age of 9, they had this little girl on methotrexate, just destroying her health. And when she turned 9, the doctor turned to her mom, looked at her mom and said, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do. Your daughter has maybe 6 months. Now imagine that. How many of you are parents? Imagine being told, after putting all your hope, faith, and trust into an expert who said, this is the right course of action to take. Imagine 7 years after you've destroyed her health with this toxic cocktail of drugs, being faced with planning for her funeral. So when Ginger was brought into my office, what angered me the most, I was like the 9th doctor. I wasn't the first. I was like the 9th. And this little girl was on her deathbed. So we tested her. We tested her for all those things that I learned in the VA hospital. I said the divine intervention, that it's God puts you in a place and He gives you the ability to learn and pay attention and observe. And He gave me the ability to learn and pay attention and observe. And we took that information, that research, and we applied it with Ginger. We tested her for food allergens. She was gluten sensitive. She was allergic to blueberries. You know what she had for breakfast every morning? A blueberry smoothie, because it's a superfood. Food can be your best friend or your worst enemy, and unfortunately, it's the slowest form of poison that we know of. And this little girl, when we changed her diet, within 6 months, her knees normalized. Within 6 months, that permanent stent that was embedded in her arm was removed. Within a year, she was in complete remission, no medicine. Now, that was almost 20 years ago. Today, she's graduated college. She's out in the world doing wonderful things. And she's got a new lease on life. Why? Thank you. Her new lease on life was because we actually looked to identify the triggers of autoimmune disease. Very important. There's 4 triggers of autoimmune disease, and the book that I was given on day 1 of being an intern in the VA hospital discussed these very triggers. You guys want to know what these triggers are? Yeah. Food is a trigger for autoimmune disease. Chemicals, chemical exposure, dyes, preservatives, the things in food, or what I call frood, but also environmental chemicals. Number 3, microbial imbalance. When I say microbial imbalance, some people think of infection. It's really not an accurate word. Infection is when a virus or a bacteria takes over. We're talking about subtler infections, more subtle kind of imbalances before they become major infection. And the 4th trigger is nutritional deficits. And all 4 of these triggers can be tested for, can be detected, and can help put autoimmune disease into full remission without the need for medication. I've seen it in thousands and thousands of patients over the last 20 years. And this is the message of hope and light that I want to bring to you this weekend. How many of you are going to be here on Sunday? Don't miss my closing talk. I'm going to dive into the depths of this topic and go into great detail for you so that you can help me spread this message of hope to this world racked by autoimmune disease. Thank you.